The last of the October light in Silverthorne Basin had a particular quality that year thin and copper-edged, the kind of light that seemed to promise nothing and deliver less. Winifred Halloran stood on the warped pine boards of her cabin porch, with a tin cup gone cold in her hand, and watched her geese, her 9 ordinary grey-brown geese, walk in unhurried formation toward the base of Ironback Ridge. She had watched them do a version of this every afternoon for the better part of a week, and had told herself each time she was seeing something else, a trick of failing daylight, the wind pushing them, some late instinct about weather. Today the sky was still and the wind was nothing at all, and the geese moved with the calm of a congregation heading toward a familiar door. Freddie was 34 and had been a widow for 10 months. Her hair was the color of wet oak and pinned back with a bone hairpin her mother had carried west from a hard county in Missouri. Her hands looked older than the rest of her because they had been asked to do the work of 2 people since the previous December, when the fever had taken Emmett Halloran between one Sunday and the next, without offering either of them a chance to say the useful things. She wore his old canvas coat over her own because it still held some faint impression of him in the seams, and because it was warmer than anything she owned in her own right. And she was not a woman who wasted warmth on sentiment when the practical answer was to wear the coat. She almost turned back. That was the part she would think about later, when the whole shape of the winter had made itself known. She almost stepped inside and set the cup on the table and let the geese be geese and let the mountain be a mountain and let the whole strange procession pass without her interference. What stopped her was something small and childish and stubborn, a refusal to let one more thing in this life happen without her seeing it plainly. Silas came out onto the porch behind her small 4'9" and thinner than she liked, his shoulder blades sharp under the wool shirt she had cut down from one of his fathers. He had the tight, dry breathing that came on him in October and stayed until the first real snow, a rattle at the top of every inhale that no doctor east or west had been able to name properly. He put his hand on the porch rail and looked north where she was looking. His voice had the flat certainty of a child who had already worked out what he thought and was waiting to see whether the adult would catch up. "They go the same way every day, Mama, same time. I counted." The word "counted" did something to her chest she did not entirely welcome. She had thought she was the only one watching. She had thought watching was the kind of grown thing a boy of 9 would not yet notice, and here he was having noticed it first and quieter about it than she had been. She set the tin cup on the rail and let the cold work its way further into her fingers so she had something honest to feel while she said the next thing. "How many days?" "6, he told her. He said it with a small, careful pride, the pride of a child who had gotten to a true thing on his own. 6 afternoons in a row, and they never came back scared. They came back like from an errand. That word errand belonged to Emmett. Emmett had used it about the smallest daily things, riding to the mill, checking the north fence an errand and back. The small verbal habit of a man who had preferred to make his days sound orderly even when they were not. Hearing it in Silas's mouth was like a small hand pressed to a bruise she had almost forgotten was there. She did not correct him. She let the word sit and did the harder thing, which was to keep her face still. Behind them, the cabin was small enough to hold their 2 lives without much slack. A single main room with the iron stove and the pine table and the 2 rockers, a curtained sleeping alcove where she and Silas both bedded down now, a lean-to for the root cellar, where the last of the fall turnips and rutabagas were stacked in a way she recounted every 3rd morning because she could not stop counting. There was a barrel of oats with the bottom showing when she tilted it toward the lamp. There was the salt pork in its crock, which she had already decided would be stretched by boiling with rutabaga rather than fried, because fried would eat itself faster. There was, in the tin box on the mantel, exactly $4.11. There was in the barn 1 mule named Boaz, who was old enough to have opinions, and a nanny goat named Prudence, who had stopped giving milk in September and was living out her last useful season eating grass Freddie could scarcely spare. The geese were the last thing on the property she still thought of as an investment rather than an expense. She had bought them the previous April from a man outside Bozeman who was heading back to Illinois with a mouthful of complaint. He had counted her coins twice as though he had expected her to come up short, and he had said the sentence she would remember for the rest of her life. "This country will take more from you than it gives, missus." She had smiled at him the way you smile at a preacher whose sermon you don't intend to follow, and had loaded the birds herself. The geese were almost to the tree line now. She could see the shape of them against the pale rock, 9 soft brown and gray silhouettes, moving into the juniper stand at the base of Ironback, with the same easy purpose they might use to approach a familiar water trough. There was no calling, no wing flapping, no ordinary goose chaos of the sort she had come to know as their baseline. There was only the walking, the small unhurried collective walking, and then the last of them vanished into the trees and did not come out the other side. Silas looked up at her. "Are we going to follow?" She thought about it for a longer beat than she wanted him to see. There were reasons not to. There were always reasons not to when a widow with a small son on 160 marginal acres was considering doing anything that was not directly on the list of chores. Weather could turn, a leg could break in juniper root. A goose was a goose was a goose, and if she lost the whole flock chasing one strange afternoon, she would spend the winter regretting it. She was already spending the winter regretting things. She had capacity for exactly no more. Then she thought about the way the man from Bozeman had said, Mrs. the small polite contempt in it. The assumption that a woman alone would eventually surrender the ground she stood on. She thought about the letter that had come 3 weeks ago in Ephraim Doss's heavy black hand, offering her $120 cash for the whole 160 acres an offer, so far below decency. It was almost an insult delivered on purpose. She thought about the second letter a week later, offering $90 and the phrasing final generous consideration. She thought about the way the water had gone thin in Deadman Creek in September, and how she had known without needing to ride and check that Doss had built up his upstream dam again on the ranch land he had bought from the Marsden estate. He was inside the law. He was inside the letter of every damn thing, and he had every intention of drying her out slow. She set the tin cup down on the rail and told Silas to fetch his boots and the small hatchet from beside the stove and the tallow candle she had been saving for a night bad enough to justify it. He was gone and back before she finished buttoning Emmett's coat over her own. That was what he was like now. She had not asked for the boy she got. She had gotten him anyway, and she was doing her best not to lean on him more than a mother should, and failing at that with a regularity she did not enjoy. They walked north across the frozen tussocks of the yard, past the barn where Boaz put his gray head over the half door, and watched them go with the flat, unimpressed patience of an animal who had seen most of what humans had to offer and been unmoved. The frost on the grass crunched under their boots in a way Freddie did not like because sound carried in Silverthorne Basin, and she had a growing preference for not being heard. She kept Silas on her left closer to the barn side, so that anyone glassing them from the ridge road above the Doss holdings would have to look past her to find the boy. She did not tell him this. He did not need to know he was being kept behind her yet. At the edge of the juniper stand, she stopped and made him stop with a hand on his shoulder. The trees here were old, their trunks twisted in the particular way of high, dry country bark peeling in long strips that smelled of turpentine and cold. The last visible track of the geese was a faint press in the frost between two roots. Freddie crouched and set her palm on the ground and felt nothing that told her anything, and stood up again and let her eyes rest on the rock face beyond the trees. It looked at first like solid limestone. It looked like the shoulder of a mountain that had never opened for anyone. Then Silas said very quietly, "Mama there." He had crouched too and was pointing at an angle she had not tried yet. She lowered herself again and looked along the line of his small, dirty finger, and she saw it. A vertical crack ran up the rock face for perhaps 6 feet wider at the base than at the top. Its opening screened almost entirely by the two nearest junipers, whose lower branches had grown together across it. like a curtain nobody had thought to draw back. From any other approach, the seam was invisible. From this one crouched angle in the last of the October light, it looked exactly like what it was, which was a door. She reached out slowly and put her hand into the gap. Warm air moved across her fingers. Not the fading warmth of sun on stone, not a trick of her cold skin. Real warmth, steady and dry, moving out of the mountain in a slow, patient exhalation, as though somewhere very deep the rock were breathing, and had been breathing all this time, and she had simply never bothered to lay her hand on the right seam. Silas's eyes went round in a way that made him look briefly younger than 9. His breathing tightened for a beat, that dry rattle rising, and she was already reaching to steady his shoulder before it turned into a full spell. He caught it. He was learning to catch it. He looked at her instead of at the mountain and waited to be told what a thing like this meant. And she discovered with a small internal lurch that she had no idea what it meant and would have to be honest about that. She kept her voice low. "We are not going in tonight." His face did the small disciplined not arguing that he had learned in the months since his father died, and she hated for a second that he had learned it. She wanted him to be a boy who argued. She had no room for a boy who argued. She squeezed his shoulder once hard and let go. "Tomorrow, in the light, with the candle and the rope and the hatchet, and I go first, you do exactly what I say." He nodded. He knew already that when she used that voice, it was not a negotiation. She broke a fresh juniper twig with a small green snap and wedged it into the seam at eye height, the pale wood showing against the grey rock. Anyone who did not know to look would still not see it. Anyone who did know would find their way back. She turned him by the shoulders and walked him out of the grove ahead of her, and she did not once look back at the crack in the mountain, because she had a superstition, inherited from her father, that a good thing looked at too greedily could be persuaded to close. They came into the yard just as the last thread of copper light went out of the sky. Prudence the goat was standing at the fence in her opinionated way. Boaz was chewing something imaginary. The geese, all 9 of them, were already back in the yard, as though they had never been anywhere at all, moving through the frost in their small, satisfied groups, settling near the water trough, with the exact posture of animals who had done a competent day's work and expected to be respected for it. Freddie counted them twice because she was not yet a woman who could take account on faith. 9. She was still counting when she heard the horse. The sound came from the south road, one animal at a walking pace, unhurried, the specific unhurried of someone who wanted to be heard before he was seen. She knew before the rider cleared the aspens who it would be, because there was really only one man in Silverthorne Basin who rode toward another person's cabin at this hour without a halloo. Thaddius Brightwell put his big roan gelding up to the gate and sat there for a beat, waiting, giving her the chance to tell him to move on if that was what she wanted. She did not tell him to move on. She also did not tell him to come in. It was a distinction he seemed to understand. He was 41 and built the way blacksmiths were built when they had been at it since 12 thick, through the shoulder and the forearm, with a kind of stillness in the rest of him that seemed to be a decision rather than a temperament. He had been a widower for 4 years. His wife Hannah and their boy Elias had gone within a week of each other in the diphtheria winter of 79, and he did not speak of them, and Freddie had never asked. And there was between the two of them the particular careful quiet of 2 people who had learned grief in different rooms and were not going to compare notes. He swung down without asking permission and lifted a small wrapped bundle out of his saddlebag. He held it in front of himself the way a man holds a thing he expects to have refused. For the boy. Silas had come up behind her. She felt him stop when he saw who it was. Tad Brightwell held out the bundle across the fence, and the shape of it in the failing light was unmistakably a pair of boy's boots, small and dark, folded in a piece of clean muslin. Freddie's throat did a thing she did not permit it to do. Her voice came out flat, because flat was the only way it was going to come out at all. He has boots. He has boots that are too small. Tad's eyes did not move from hers. There was no pity in them. Freddie could have refused pity. What was in his eyes was harder, a plain, accurate observation of a fact she had been trying to keep from being a fact that her son's toes had been curled inside his summer boots for 3 weeks, and she had not yet found the 20 cents she needed at the general store to trade up. These were Elias's. They have been sitting in a chest for 4 years. They would like to be walked in. Silas made a small hopeful sound, and then swallowed it because he had learned to read his mother before he had learned to read letters. Freddie felt the weight of that small swallowed sound settle somewhere under her breastbone. She thought of the crack in the mountain. She thought of the 9 geese in her yard. She thought of $90 from Ephraim Doss, and of the water in Deadman Creek, and of how tired she was in a specific bone-deep way of being the woman who said no on principle. She reached across the fence and took the bundle. "Thank you, Tad." He nodded once, as though thanks had been a currency he had not expected to receive today, and was not entirely sure what to do with. He did not step past the fence. He did not press. He looked at her for a moment longer, with the plain, steady expression that had, she was beginning to realize, been directed her way at intervals throughout the past 10 months without her permitting herself to notice. Doss came into the shop yesterday. Her hands, which had begun to loosen around the bundle, tightened again. "And wanted a chain fixed, wanted more to talk. He asked after you." Tad's voice did not change a register. He was reporting, not warning, and letting her decide which it was. He asked after the boy. He said the words winter and hard in the same sentence more times than a man ordinarily needs to. "He is trying to soften ground." "He is?" Tad's jaw worked once, a small movement she caught only because the rest of him was so still. "Freddie, he is not going to stop at letters. You are going to need people this winter. I am one of them if you will let me be. There are others if you will let them be. That is all I came to say." She did not answer for a beat. The stars were coming out behind him hard and bright, the kind of stars that in Silverthorne Basin looked as though they had been driven into the sky with a hammer. She wanted absurdly to tell him about the crack in the rock. The wanting itself surprised her enough that she distrusted it. She had known this man for 2 years and had not permitted herself to tell him anything that mattered. And the fact that a warm draft on her palm had almost undone that discipline was a piece of information about herself she was going to have to sit with later. "I hear you, Tad. Ride safe." He touched the brims of his hat. He mounted with the easy economy of a man who had done it 40,000 times, and he rode back out through the gate at the same unhurried pace he had come in at. She stood at the fence with the bundle of boots pressed against her ribs and watched until the sound of the roan's hooves was gone into the cold, and then she turned Silas by the shoulders and walked him inside. He tried the boots on at the table by the light of the single lamp. They fit. Of course they fit. Tad Brightwell was a man who measured before he offered. Silas walked twice around the small room in them, careful and delighted, in the disciplined way of a child who had been taught not to make too much of good things in case they were taken back. And then he took them off and set them by the stove with the reverence of an altar boy handling silver. Freddie did not trust her voice yet, so she ladled out the rutabaga and salt pork and sat down across from him, and they ate. She did not sleep well. She lay on her side in the alcove with Silas warm against her back, breathing his rattling child breath into the wool blanket. And she listened to the mountain not moving, and to the cabin holding, and to the small wind pushing at the north wall. She thought about the seam in the rock. She thought about the letter from Doss. She thought about the way Tad Brightwell had said, "If you will let me be." She had not let anyone be anything for 10 months, and she had a suspicion, the shape of which she did not yet want to look at directly, that the not letting had cost her more than the letting would have. When she finally slept, it was thin and gray and dreamless. They went at 10 the next morning when the light was as strong as October was going to give her. She had made the tallow candle stubbier for portability and lit and blown it once at the table to make sure the wick was true. She had a coil of hemp rope over her shoulder that had been Emmett's and still smelled faintly of the barn. She had the small hatchet in her belt and Emmett's old skinning knife in her boot and in the pouch at her hip. 3 cold biscuits and a strip of jerky in case they were in there longer than she meant to be. Silas walked behind her in Elias Brightwell's dead boy's boots, and neither of them spoke about that, because there was nothing to say about it that would not have made the day harder than it needed to be. The crack was where they had left it. The juniper twig was still wedged at eye height, pale against the gray. Freddie crouched and set her palm inside the seam and felt the same steady warm exhalation, and something in her stomach settled that had been unsettled since the light had gone the night before. Real then, not a fever of an underfed brain. Real. She told Silas the thing she had rehearsed on the walk up. He was going to stay outside. He was going to sit against the trunk of the near juniper with the hatchet across his knees and count slowly to 200. If she was not back by 200, he was going to walk, not run back to the cabin, take Boaz and ride for Tad. Brightwell's shop and tell Tad exactly where the market seam was. He was not going to come in after her under any condition she could think of, and none she could not. His face did the small, disciplined not arguing. She hated it again and used it anyway. She kissed the top of his head, which she had not done in daylight since the summer, and she turned sideways and went into the mountain. The passage was tight for the first 6 feet, in a way that made her acutely aware of the width of her own shoulders and the softness of the parts of her that were not shoulder. Cold rock on one side, rougher rock on the other. Her face turned up toward a strip of pale sky that narrowed and then vanished as the seam closed above her. She struck the flint with fingers that shook once and then decided not to shake, and the tallow caught, and the small yellow flame stood up in air that did not move enough to disturb it. Then the passage widened, and she stepped out. The chamber was larger than any interior space she had stood in west of the Missouri. The ceiling arched up into a dome of pale gold limestone, marked with the slow, patient scoring of water over ages. The floor rose in gentle, uneven terraces that caught the candlelight and held it. The air was warm in a way that was not the warmth of a stove or a body, but the warmth of something older. A settled underground temperature that had probably not moved by more than a degree or 2 in her lifetime or her grandmother's. It smelled of clean mineral and dry feather, and the faint pepper of goose droppings, and under all of it, a thin, cool draft from somewhere deeper that told her the room was not a dead end. The mountain had rooms behind this room. She was standing in only the first of them. She did not at first understand what she was looking at on the terraces. Her eye kept trying to make the shapes on the pale stone into something familiar. Then her eye caught up with her, and she understood. And she stopped breathing for a beat. The geese had used the natural water-carved hollows in the terrace floor as nests. Dozens of hollows. Each one fitted to its purpose as though the rock had been made for the bird, rather than the bird found for the rock. In each hollow, arranged with a care that read as unmistakably intentional, lay eggs. The active clutches were tight and centered, the newer eggs bright cream against the older ones that had gone the color of oiled bone. Around the outer rim of each hollow, pushed there by the flock's own tidy sorting, lay a scatter of other eggs unattended, display set aside from the working center of the nest. The geese themselves were up in the second and third terraces. Most of the flock ranged at the higher, warmer levels, watching her with the incurious calm of creatures who had been safe in this chamber longer than she had been alive. One goose in the deepest hollow at the back of the cave, larger than the others, and darker across the shoulders, looked at her directly, and did not look away, and did not move. Freddie understood without being told that this was the one in charge, and that she was being permitted on a trial basis to remain. She lowered the candle slowly and set her free hand flat on the terrace stone, warm through her palm, steady. The rock had been keeping this temperature since before Silverthorne Basin had had a name in English on any map. She thought about the outer eggs, the discarded ones, and she thought about the salt pork in the crock, and she thought about the $4.11 in the tin box, and she felt her own arithmetic begin to change shape underneath her. in a way she had not felt since Emmett was alive. She did not touch the active clutches. She did not touch anything else either, not on this first visit. She had come in to see. She stayed inside long enough to walk the length of the lower terrace, once counting hollows under her breath. 23 of them by her count, and then she made herself turn around and go back through the seam, because she had told Silas 200, and she was not going to be the mother who broke a promise on the day she asked her son to sit outside a mountain alone. He was at 142. His lips were moving. His face when he saw her was flooded with a relief he was trying very hard not to show. She sat down beside him against the trunk of the juniper and took the hatchet out of his hands and set it aside, and she put her arm around his thin shoulders and held him against her for as long as she could permit herself. Then she stood and brushed the frost off her skirt. She waited until they were halfway back to the cabin before she said any of it. She said it walking without looking at him, because she had learned that Silas received hard information better when he was in motion. She told him what was in there. She told him what she thought it meant. She told him the two rules that were forming themselves in her head as she spoke them out loud, that they would only ever touch the outer displaced eggs, and that no other person alive was going to hear a word about the cave until she said so. He walked beside her in Elias Brightwell's boots and listened with the flat, serious attention he had inherited from his father. And when she was done, he said only, "Not even Mr. Brightwell." Not yet. He accepted that. He accepted most things she said, which was, she was aware, both a blessing and a small ongoing grief. She took one egg on the second visit 2 days later. Only one. She chose it from the outermost rim of the nearest hollow, an egg that had gone the color of old cream and been pushed clear of the working center of the nest by the goose herself. She carried it back to the cabin in her coat pocket, wrapped in a fold of muslin, and she stood at the stove for a long minute with the egg in her hand before she cracked it into the skillet with the small internal ceremony of a woman testing a theory that would decide her winter. The white was dense. The yolk stood up firm and deep gold, darker than a fresh yolk, closer to the color of a good mustard. It smelled clean. She cooked it in a slick of pork fat and let it set through, because she was not going to feed a runny egg from an unknown source to her son under any theology. And then she cut it in half and put half on Silas's plate and half on her own, and she watched his face. He ate, he chewed, he swallowed. He looked up at her. "It's good, Mama. It tastes like eggs." She ate her half. It tasted like eggs. It tasted a little denser than a fresh egg, the way she remembered the eggs of late fall, tasting in her mother's kitchen when the hens had begun to slow and it sat well in her stomach. And an hour later she was not sick. And 2 hours later, Silas was not sick. And by supper time she had begun quietly, and without permitting herself to name it, to hope. She did not permit herself to hope more than that yet. She had a great deal of respect for the ways that hope unchecked could injure a person in this country. She thought instead about the arithmetic. She thought about how many outer eggs she had seen in a single hollow, and how many hollows she had counted, and how carefully she would have to move to make the taking sustainable, rather than the kind of raid that would drive the flock out to some other mountain. She thought about the winter ahead of her, and about Silas's rattling breath, and about the $4.11, and about $90 from Ephraim Doss. And she began to understand with a slow, steady clarity that felt almost like anger that she had been handed something she was not going to give up. The trouble arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in the shape of a young man on a good sorrel horse. Freddie was at the woodpile when she heard him come up the south road, and she knew before he cleared the aspens that he was not Tad Brightwell, because Tad Brightwell would have called out. This rider did not call. He came at a walking pace, easy with the specific loose reins of a man who wanted his approach to look unplanned. He was tall and lean and about 26, with the sunburned, raw-boned handsomeness of a boy who had been put on a horse before he was old enough to walk. She had never spoken to him. She did not need to have spoken to him. His father had a mustache exactly like his, and a mouth held exactly the same way. Josiah Merrick reined in at the gate and touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers. Silas, over by the goose pen, straightened up. He was carrying a length of switch he had been using to nudge the flock toward the trough, and she saw with a small unpleasant clench, standing exactly where a rider at the gate could see him clearly. She stepped away from the woodpile with the axe still in her hand, casually, the way a woman would if the axe simply happened to be there. "Mrs. Halloran." His voice was easy. His eyes were not. They had moved past her already and were on the geese and then on the barn and then on the long, slow rise of ground behind the cabin toward the juniper stand and ironback ridge. "I was riding a strayed calf up the draw, and I believe I have lost him. Have you seen a red heifer with a white sock, ma'am?" "I have not." "Well?" He smiled. It was a nice smile. It had been trained to be a nice smile since he was about 10 years old and had probably worked on a great many people. It did not work on her. "Fine-looking flock you have there. Unusual to see so many geese still on the ground this late in the year. They stay warm, do they now?" He was looking at the geese again, and then very briefly past them at the ridge. She watched his eyes go and come back. She watched him decide that she had watched him do it. His smile stayed exactly where it had been. "Mind if I water the sorrel at your trough?" "I do mind." Her voice came out of her without any preparation level and quiet, and she felt Silas go still on the other side of the yard. "Deadman's a quarter-mile east. He can drink there." Josiah Merrick looked at her for a long, careful beat. He did not stop smiling. He touched the brim of his hat again, more slowly this time, in a way that was almost but not quite a mockery of the first time. "Ma'am, you have a fine afternoon." He turned the sorrel and rode back down the south road at the same walking pace, and Freddie stood at the woodpile with the axe in her hand until she could no longer hear him. And then for another full minute after that, because she did not entirely trust her ears. When she finally turned around, Silas was standing very close behind her. His breath was doing the rattle. His eyes were bigger than she wanted them to be. She set the axe down slowly and knelt in front of him and put her hands on his shoulders and made her voice into the flat, calm thing she saved for exactly these moments. "Listen to me. That man is not a neighbor. That man is not lost. That man is Ephraim Doss's son, and he came here on purpose to look at us. And he saw more than I wanted him to. Do you understand me?" He nodded. His mouth was tight. "From now on, when you are outside the cabin, you are inside the barn or inside my sight. Not both is fine. One of them is required. That is the rule. Do you understand?" He nodded again. He said in a voice that was smaller than she wanted to hear. He was looking at the ridge. "I know, Mama." His hand came up and closed around her wrist. His fingers were cold. "Are they going to try to take it?" She had been braced for a lot of questions from him over the past 10 months. She had not been braced for that one from a 9-year-old. She looked at him for a moment and made herself say the true thing, because she had already decided without noticing herself deciding that she was not going to be the mother who lied to him about this. "They are going to try, and we are not going to let them." She rode into Copper Kettle Flats the next morning on Boaz alone, because she had a list of exactly 4 items she needed at the general store, and because she wanted the town's ear more than she wanted the town's company. She wanted to know what was being said and by whom. She left Silas at the cabin with instructions to bar the door and to feed the stove down low and to keep the goose gate latched. And she rode out at a walk in Emmett's coat, with her hair pinned tight under her Sunday bonnet. Because looking respectable in Copper Kettle Flats bought a woman a small margin of extra attention when she needed it. The general store was Whitcomb's one long low room with a plank counter and a stove in the middle, and a permanent smell of coffee and leather and lamp oil. Old Whitcomb himself was behind the counter with his ledger open, and there were 3 other people in the store, and Freddie counted them without appearing to, and catalogued them without appearing to do that either. A tall, gaunt man in a preacher's black coat she did not know, examining a bolt of muslin with the disapproving intensity of a man who had come in for something else. A short, broad woman she recognized as the wife of the Fenwick homestead over on the west slope, standing near the flower, with her mouth held tight in a way Freddie recognized because she had worn the same mouth herself. And near the back by the coffee tins, a very thin man in a coat too light for the weather, arguing quietly with Whitcomb in a voice that was trying not to be an argument. She heard before she meant to hear it the word credit. The thin man was standing with his hat off, turning it in his fingers, and Whitcomb was shaking his head, and the thin man was saying something about spring, and about hay he had already sold forward, and about a wife and 3 children, just come out from Ohio in September, and the potato crop damaged in the October wet. He said, "Ridley." He said, "Elias Ridley." He was, she realized, about 35, and his hands where they held the hat were shaking very slightly. And he was doing everything he could to keep that shake out of his voice, and mostly succeeding. Whitcomb kept shaking his head, not without kindness, just with the flat impossibility of a man who had extended credit into too many empty seasons already. Freddie moved down the counter and pretended to look at lampwicks. Behind her, the Fenwick woman muttered something to no one in particular about her husband's leg, which had been broken in early October. The bone set, but the man not yet fit to stand a shift at anything, and about how the winter store had been planned for a working man and not a laid-up one, and about how she was 3 weeks away from having to slaughter their milk cow to keep the children in something more than turnip. She said it flat into the flour barrel, the way a woman says a thing so that she has said it to someone, even if the someone was only a barrel of flour. The preacher in the black coat cleared his throat and did not turn around. The doorbell went. Freddie did not turn around either, and she knew who it was because Whitcomb's face changed by exactly the amount it changed for exactly one man in the basin. She heard the boots come across the plank. She heard the small change in the air that a room made when a person who owned a lot of it walked in. She stayed at the lampwicks and let her peripheral vision do the work. Ephraim Doss was 52 and built thick and square with a beard trimmed to the exact edge of respectability and a black wool coat cut by a tailor east of the Mississippi. He carried a leather portfolio under his arm. He greeted Whitcomb by his first name. He said hello to the preacher, whom he clearly knew, and he glanced without appearing to at the Fenwick woman, and he glanced without appearing to at Elias Ridley's. And then he set his portfolio on the counter and unbuttoned his coat with the specific, unhurried gesture of a man for whom rooms waited. He raised his voice by exactly enough. "Whitcomb, while I have a room, a friendly notice. I am prepared this winter to make fair cash offers on any parcel adjoining my Marsden holding, whose owner finds himself pressed. Fair cash. In hand on the day, no paperwork through the territorial office. My man in copper kettle keeps the ledger. Any homesteader here in earshot who wishes to spare himself a hard march is welcome to speak to me." The Fenwick woman's knuckles on the flour barrel went white. Elias Ridley put his hat back on with both hands carefully, as though the hat had become an object he did not entirely trust himself to handle. The preacher in the black coat murmured something approving. Whitcomb kept his face still. Freddie turned around then. She had not planned to. She turned around because she could feel the room tilting toward a small, quiet surrender. And she was not, it turned out, willing to stand at the lampwicks and pretend she had not heard. She met Ephraim Doss's eyes across the length of the store. He saw her. He did not look surprised to see her. He inclined his head half an inch courteously, the way a man inclines his head to a piece of land he intends to buy. "Mrs. Halloran, my 3rd letter is on its way. I hope you will read it with an open mind. I read your first 2, Mr. Doss." Her voice came out into the store steady and carrying, not loud but shaped so that it reached the flour barrel and the coffee tins and the muslin bolt without any of them having to strain. $90 for 160 acres with year-round water is not a fair cash offer. It is a shame you should feel in your own mouth. The store went very quiet. Whitcomb's pen stopped. The preacher turned his head. The Fenwick woman did not turn her head, But Freddie saw her shoulders lift by a small fraction, the way a woman's shoulders lifted when someone else had said the sentence she had been swallowing. Ephraim Doss smiled. It was not a nice smile. It was not exactly an unkind smile either. It was the smile of a man who had just been given useful information and was already deciding what to do with it. "We shall see about the water, Mrs. Halloran. Winter is long. Good day to you." He picked up his portfolio and walked back out into the cold, and the bell over the door rang once behind him, and the room breathed. Elias Ridley looked at Freddie for one long beat with a face that she could not entirely read, and then he looked away and put his hat on straight and walked out after Doss without buying his coffee. The Fenwick woman turned from the flour barrel and said quietly only to Freddie, "Thank you, Mrs. Halloran," and then went back to counting what she could and could not afford. Freddie bought her salt and her thread and her tin of matches and her small twist of tea. She did not buy anything on credit. She rode Boaz home in a cold, flat afternoon light that seemed for the first time in a year to have something in it besides indifference, and she thought the whole way about the room she had just walked out of, and about how many rooms exactly like it there must be in exactly this basin, and about how each of those rooms contained a woman who had been swallowing a sentence. Silas met her at the barn. He was fine. The stove was fine. The geese were fine. She sat down at the pine table without taking her coat off and put both her hands flat on the wood and stared at them for a long minute, while Silas stood very still on the other side of the room and did not interrupt her. She thought about the crack in Ironback Ridge and about the 23 hollows on the lower terrace and about the dense gold yolk in the skillet and about her son's foot inside a dead boy's boot. She thought about Ephraim Doss's smile in Whitcomb's and about the Fenwick woman's shoulders and about Elias Ridley's shaking hands on the brim of his hat. She thought about her father saying, "The mountain gives to the one who knows how to wait," and she thought, for the first time, and with a small, clean shock, that waiting alone was not the same thing as waiting well. She looked up at Silas. Her voice when it came was quiet, and it was for him, and it was also for herself, because she had discovered that some sentences you could only fully believe after you had heard yourself say them out loud. "We are not going to sit on it, sweet boy. We are going to share it, carefully, with the right people in the right order. Because if we sit on it, we will keep this cabin, and Doss will take the basin. And I am not going to be the woman in this valley who saved herself and let the rest of it fall." Silas looked at her with his father's serious eyes. He did not say anything at all. He crossed the room in 3 of his small, deliberate steps, and he leaned against her side, and he stayed there. And outside the cabin, the last of the daylight went, and behind the cabin, the mountain sat in the dark, keeping its warmth in its deep, steady, patient way, waiting to be asked properly. November came in over Silverthorne Basin the way it always did without ceremony, laying down 2 inches of dry, powdery snow overnight that squeaked underfoot in the morning like unoiled hinges. Freddie stood at the barn door watching the geese move through the white in their small, unbothered groups, leaving neat lines of triangular prints toward the trough. And she understood that the private season was over. She had 1 week, maybe 2, before the snow got serious enough to make her tracks readable across a 1/4 mile of open ground. Anyone who wanted to know where a woman walked in the afternoon would soon be able to read it as plainly as a page. She had made her promise at the pine table with Silas leaning against her side, and the mountain, indifferent as ever, had not adjusted its calendar to accommodate it. She built the sled in the space behind the barn where the wind broke against the woodshed and gave her 3 hours of near still air in the middle of the day. She used the 2 long spruce planks she had been saving for a lean-to. She now understood she was never going to build, and she shaped the runners out of a length of dense oak that had come with the cabin in the estate list and had been sitting under the eaves since Emmett was alive. She had never built a sled from scratch. She had helped Emmett once. That was the extent of her training. She worked slowly, and she measured twice, and she cut once, and where her cuts were crooked, She planed them back and made them straight because a crooked sled would announce itself in the passage, and she did not have time for a sled that announced itself. Silas held boards for her without being asked. He held them for as long as she needed them held. He handed her nails from the tin and the small handful of iron pegs she had scavenged out of a broken bucket. And when she asked for the draw knife, he handed her the draw knife. And when she asked for the mallet, he handed her the mallet, and his face during all of this was the face of a boy who had decided in some private ceremony he had not shared with her that he was now a partner instead of a child. She let him be. She had not wanted this for him. She had not wanted his father to die in December, or his own lungs to fail him in October, or a stranger on a sorrel horse to teach him that men could ride up to your fence and mean harm. All of that was already in him, though. All of that was a fact she could not undo, and pretending it was not so would only insult him. On the third afternoon of the sled work, while she was shaving the front runner to a shallow curve, Silas said, without looking up from the box of nails, "Papa would have done the runners different." She held the draw knife still. How? Steeper. He said flat runners catch on the first stone. He said a good sled climbs out of a rut instead of trying to plow through it. The boy looked up at her, his eyes the same serious brown as Emmett's, and the same shape and the same steady angle, and she felt her chest do the small careful clench it did when the dead spoke through the living. "He told me that when we build the milk sled, then we will do them steeper." Her voice was even. She turned the runner over and marked a fresh line with the pencil she kept behind her ear, higher up at the angle he had described. And Silas came around to watch. And he nodded once when the line looked right, and she cut to his father's memory, and the sled that came off the sawhorses that evening rode higher at the nose than she would have made it on her own, and rode it because a 9-year-old had corrected her. She did not say thank you out loud. Silas would not have wanted her to. She squeezed the back of his neck once briefly when she came inside, and he leaned into her hand for a beat before going to wash for supper. And that was the whole of the transaction. She did not go to the cave for 4 days after she finished the sled. She wanted the snow to settle. She wanted Josiah Merrick, if he was still riding the South Road, to lose interest in a widow who never seemed to go anywhere. She wanted the flock to habituate to the new object in the yard, so that when the day came to pull it north through the frost, the geese would not spook and make a scene. Mostly she wanted the sled itself to sit a night in the cold and tell her which joints she had gotten wrong, because a joint that was going to fail would fail on a still night before it failed under a load. The joints held. She went in on the 5th morning. The passage took the sled the way a well-fitted glove took a hand. She had built it narrow enough that the runners cleared the widest point of the seam with an inch on either side, which meant she had to walk it in sideways and lift the nose over the small lip at the base where the rock still jutted. But once she was through the pinch, it slid on the smooth chamber floor with the specific low whisper of oak on limestone. The candle caught the second time. The chamber was as it had been, warm and dry and mineral-smelling. The flock at its higher terraces watching her with the flat indifference of tenants who had decided a new landlord was tolerable if she stayed on her side of the room. She worked to the outer margins only as she had promised herself she would, moving along the lower terrace in slow, careful arcs, checking each egg in the candlelight before she lifted it. The old ones, the truly abandoned outer rim eggs, she left where they were because the flock had made the choice and she was not going to overwrite it. The middle margin eggs, the ones the geese had displaced in the past few weeks and not returned to, she took one at a time, wrapping each in a fold of straw and nesting it in the sled bed. She counted as she went. 27 from the lower terrace. 9 more from the near end of the middle terrace, where an old goose had abandoned a partial clutch weeks ago in favor of a warmer hollow further back. 36 eggs, a number she would remember, because it was the first honest inventory of what the mountain had actually offered her. The dominant goose watched her the entire time from the deep hollow at the back. She did not move. She did not hiss. She did not lower her head in the warning posture Freddie had seen her use twice already, on lesser geese who had encroached on her water. She simply watched unblinking the way a magistrate watched a defendant during closing remark. And Freddie understood in some pre-verbal part of her chest that she was being permitted to remove exactly this much and no more, and that the permission was not going to be extended if she asked for it again too soon. She pulled the sled back out through the pinch with her heart oddly steady. She had been afraid in the days between the promise and the first harvest that some part of her would prove greedier than she had rehearsed. It had not. She had wanted walking the terrace only what she had said she would want. Whatever else was wrong with her, that at least was still hers. She stopped, though, at the seam itself. She had promised herself she would not put off the second problem past the first solve. And there it was above the entrance, exactly where her palm had told her 4 days ago that something was not right. A hairline crack no more than the width of a horsehair running along the underside of the arch above the entrance for perhaps 18 inches. She had not put it there. She could not tell standing beneath it with a candle whether it had been there for a decade or had opened the week she had begun bringing a sled through. She only knew that if she left it as it was through a hard freeze and thaw, it would not still be a horsehair by spring. She needed a beam. She needed a beam cut to a specific length by a person with the tools to notch it clean, someone who would set 2 seatings into the rock on either side of the opening without shaking loose whatever was holding the arch together. She could not do that alone. She had spent 3 years learning to do a great many things alone, and the mountain in its patient way had just handed her a task that told her the count of those things was going to have to change. She rode into Copperquettle Flats the next afternoon with the sled load hidden under a canvas in the barn, and Silas locked into the cabin with a book and a plate of biscuit. She did not go to Whitcomb's. She went past Whitcomb's and past the Mercantile and past the small unpainted building that served as the assay office in the summer and stood empty most of the winter. And she rode Boaz to the far end of the main street, where the smithy sat at the edge of the aspens with smoke coming out of the forge chimney in a thick, clean column that told her Thad Brightwell had been working since dawn. He was at the anvil when she came in. He did not stop what he was doing because a piece of iron on the anvil did not care about visitors. But he lifted his eyes to her across the shop and let them stay there a beat longer than a smith's eyes ordinarily stayed on a customer. Freddie waited until he had set the piece back into the coals before she spoke. She spoke without ceremony because ceremony between them had never been the currency. "Tad, I need a beam." "I sell beams." The smallest curve at the corner of his mouth. "What length?" She had rehearsed the answer on the ride-in and had decided against the shorter one. She said evenly, 4'6" long, 6 inches square, notched at both ends to seat into limestone. The notches at an angle of about 10 degrees off level because the seatings are not perfectly opposite. "I need it in 3 days. I need to pick it up from the shop after dark. I'm not going to tell you what it is for." Thad Brightwell put the tongs down. He wiped his hands on the leather apron slowly in a way that gave him time to arrange his face. He looked at her for a long, careful beat. Then he crossed the shop and pulled a stub of pencil from the ledge above the coal bin and picked up a scrap of pine board, and he sketched without asking her another question. The exact beam she had described with the notches at the angle she had described, and he wrote a price at the bottom of the sketch that was, she realized, low enough to be an insult if it had come from any other man. "I cannot pay that." Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I can pay half now and half at Christmas. I will not take it as a gift." "You will not take it as a gift because you have promised yourself you will not take gifts." His eyes lifted to hers. There was no impatience in them. There was only the small, direct calm of a man saying a thing he had been waiting to say. "Freddie, that is a promise you made in a room I was not in. It is not owed to me. Pay me at Christmas. Pay me in the spring. Pay me in eggs if it comes to it. When you are ready to tell me what the beam is for, I will listen. Until then, I am going to make the beam because you asked me to make it and because you asked me straight." She did not answer for a beat. She had prepared for haggling. She had not prepared for being met like that at the plainness of her own asking, without her having to pay for the meeting with an explanation. Something in her chest went momentarily crooked and then straightened. She nodded once. She said quietly, "Thank you, Tad." He touched the ledge above the coal bin with 2 fingers. The way another man might tip a hat, and turned back to his anvil, and she walked out of the smithy and mounted Boaz and rode home. And on the ride, she found herself thinking for the first time in months about her own face in her mother's hand mirror, and about whether she still knew what it looked like to be a woman who could be seen without being surveyed. Otilia Vance she went to on the following morning. She had not decided on Otilia the way she had decided on Tad in the middle of the general store, with a portfolio smiling at her. She had decided on Otilia years ago in an afternoon, when the old woman had come to the cabin without being asked at the news that Emmett had begun to fail, and had sat with him and with Freddie for 2 long nights. Without speaking a word, she did not need to speak, and had made a broth that he had been able to keep down when he could not keep down water, and had asked on leaving only that Freddie fetch her again when the time came. Otilia Vance had not been a midwife in 20 years. She had been before that a midwife for 30. What she still was at 68 was the only person Freddie had ever met who could look at another human being for a full minute without deciding anything about them. Otilia's cabin sat on a rise above Deadman Creek, where the trees thinned. She was in her yard when Freddie rode up, splitting kindling with a small axe in a wool skirt and a man's canvas coat and boots that did not match her white braid pinned up flat under a knitted cap. She saw Freddie and set the axe against the block and waited. Freddie did not dismount immediately. She sat on Boaz at the gate for a moment because the sentence she had prepared was a large sentence and she wanted to know she was ready to say it. When she was ready, she swung down and led Boaz through the gate to the small hitching post, and she looped his reins, and she came up to the woodpile and stopped an arm's length from the old woman. "Otilia, I have found something on my land. I need you to hear about it before anyone else does, because I do not know if what I am doing with it is right, and you are the person I will trust to tell me if it is not." Otilia Vance looked at her. Her eyes were pale and sharp under the knitted cap. She said at length, "Sit down on the block, Winifred. I will put water on." They sat inside at the small pine table, and Freddie told the whole of it in order without decoration from the afternoon. Silas had told her the geese went at the same time to the tally of 36 eggs on the sled the day before. She told it plainly because she had learned in 10 months of widowhood that the truth in this country was a fragile object best handled without ornament. She told the 2 rules she had made herself. She told the crack in the arch and the beam she had ordered from Tad. She told the smile on Ephraim Doss's mouth in the general store. She did not tell about Silas's father's boots on his feet, because that was not Otilia's business, and she had a growing sense that she was going to need some things to still be only hers. Otilia did not interrupt her. When Freddie was finished, the old woman sat for a long minute with her cup in both hands and did not drink. Then she set the cup down and folded her hands over each other on the table, veined and dark-spotted and steady, and she began in the slow measured voice she used only when she was telling another person exactly what she knew, and no more to give Freddie back the science of what the mountain was doing. An unfertilized goose egg, Otilia told her in an unchanging, cool, dry space, would hold clean for around 3 to 4 months, not longer. Anyone who told her otherwise was selling her a story. A fertilized egg the flock had begun to work, and had then abandoned, would go off faster than that days rather than months. So any egg that had been under a brooding hen for even a short time before being displaced was not to be taken under any condition. The way to tell the difference, Otilia said, was in the shell and the weight and the small sound the egg made when tapped gently against the ear. The good outer margin eggs, the ones a well-run flock had culled early, because they knew them for infertile, would ring lightly and feel heavy for their size. The bad ones would sound hollow and would feel light. Freddie would learn the difference inside a week. Otilia herself would show her, and the count. Freddie's throat was dry. How much can I take before I do harm? The old woman's eyes did not leave hers. Take no more than 2/3 of the outer displaced eggs from any hollow in any given week. Leave the last third alone, even if you can see with your own eyes it is not going to hatch. The geese need to feel that they have set aside more than has been taken from them. If they ever stop feeling that they will leave, and this mountain will be a mountain again, you will be a woman with 160 acres and nothing else. Otilia unfolded her hands and laid one of them flat on the table between them. Winifred, what you have found is not a treasure. It is a partnership. The flock has been keeping it for reasons of its own. You are not the owner of a mine. You are a guest at a table someone else set. Behave accordingly, and it will feed this valley for a long time. Behave otherwise, and it will not. Freddie sat with that. It rearranged something in her that she had without knowing she was doing. It'd been rearranging on her own for weeks. She had been coming at the thing as though it were an object she had discovered. Otilia had, in one clean sentence, told her it was a room she had walked into and would either be invited to remain in or asked to leave. She reached across the table and covered Otilia's hand with her own briefly, because there was no other appropriate response. And Otilia let her, and neither of them said anything else about it. They drank the tea. They planned the first delivery. The first delivery went to the Purnell place on the last Wednesday of November in a light dry snow that did not stick. Freddie drove Boaz and the small sled with 14 eggs packed in straw beneath a piece of oiled canvas. She did not take Silas. She did not want him at the door with her the first time she asked another woman to accept what she had brought, because a boy at a door softened a transaction into something that felt like charity, and she was determined that this not be charity. It was to be from the first minute an exchange. Sarah Purnell was in the yard when Freddie pulled up in a shawl too thin for the day-throwing scratch to a scatter of hens that was still surviving out of stubbornness. She had been widowed for a year and a half. Her husband had gone through the ice on Deadman Creek the previous spring, on his way home from a night at the assay office, and she had been raising 4 children alone since, on a quarter section that was too small to feed them and too remote to sell for anything decent. Her oldest, Cletus, was 17, big through the shoulders, in the specific way of a boy who had done a man's work early, and he came around the corner of the cabin at the sound of the sled and stopped when he saw who it was. Freddie did not dismount. She kept her seat on the box of the sled, and kept her voice even, and kept the sentence she had rehearsed clean of anything that could be mistaken for pity. Sarah, I have a small surplus this month. Eggs, they will not keep past January. I would rather they went into your children than into my compost. I'm going to leave you the basket at the door. Next spring, when the ground is soft, Cletus can come and help me put up the west section of my fence, which I could not put up on my own last year. That is the trade. Sarah Purnell stood very still in the light snow with the scratch bucket at her hip. She looked at Freddie for a beat that went longer than was comfortable, and Freddie made herself let it go long, because she had understood on the ride over that the hardest part of the exchange was not going to be the offering, but the receiving. Sarah's mouth worked once. She looked at Cletus, who had not moved. She looked back at Freddie. Her voice, when it came, was rougher than usual, but it was steady. Cletus will be at your fence in April. Bring the basket to the door, Winifred. Freddie did. She set 14 eggs in straw on the porch board, and Cletus came up beside her without being asked, and lifted the basket and carried it inside, and Sarah touched the sleeve of Freddie's coat once briefly on the way past, and that was the whole of it. Freddie was back on Boaz and out to the road inside 2 minutes. She did not look back until the Purnell cabin was out of sight behind the aspens, because she had a suspicion that looking back would have made her cry, and she did not have the time for that in her afternoon. She went to the Fenwick place next. Almira Fenwick met her at the door with the same tight mouth she had worn at the Flower Barrel in Whitcomb's. and she took 10 eggs into a home that had not seen a fresh egg since October. And she said only when Freddie turned to go, "My man will bring you a cord of split pine before the ice sets, Winifred. He can do it sitting down from a wagon. Do not tell him I made the arrangement. Tell him you asked for it." Freddie touched her sleeve as Sarah had touched hers and rode on. She went to the Ridley place last because it was the newest homestead and the one she was least sure of. Elias Ridley opened the door himself. He recognized her from Whitcomb's. He did not smile. His wife, a small dark-haired woman named Marcy with a baby on her hip, and a girl of about 6 clinging to her skirt, came up behind him and saw Freddie and the sled and the basket and stopped where she stood. Elias's hand went to the door frame as though he needed the wood under his fingers to keep from doing something he had not decided about. Freddie said, as evenly as she had said it at the Purnell gate, that she had a small surplus, that the eggs would not keep, that she would rather they went into their children, that Elias come thaw could give her 3 days of work on a section of barn wall she had not been able to raise on her own. Elias Ridley did not answer her for the length of one long breath. His face did something small and painful that she did not entirely understand at the time. Then Marcy stepped past him and took the basket out of Freddie's hands directly, and she said quietly into Freddie's face, "God bless you, Mrs. Halloran." And she carried the basket inside, and Elias stood in the door for one more second, looking at Freddie with a face that had something in it she could not read. And then he said thickly, 3 days in spring, I will remember it. You have my word." And he closed the door. She rode back to the cabin in a slate blue dusk with the empty sled hissing quietly behind Boaz, and she felt for the first time since the previous Christmas, as though she were doing something in Silverthorne Basin that was going to matter beyond the moment she was doing it. The feeling was not exhilaration. It was smaller and steadier than that. It felt like traction the way a boot felt when it had finally found purchase on a slope that had been slipping for a long time. The beam came out of Thad Brightwell's shop 3 nights later. She went in after full dark, and he had it standing against the wall wrapped in burlap, and he helped her lash it to the sled without asking a single question. He walked her out to the road. At the road he stopped and he looked north toward Ironback in the moonlight, and he said evenly without looking at her, "If whatever you are bracing needs a second pair of hands to see it, I have hands when you are ready." She did not answer him. She squeezed his forearm through the sleeve of his coat briefly, and she rode out into the cold and behind her. He stood in the moonlight for a long time before he went back inside his shop. She seated the beam alone the next morning with the small pry bar and the sledge she was almost afraid to use. She did not swing the sledge. She used the pry bar to walk each end of the beam by fractions of an inch into the notches Thad had cut for it, resting between adjustments to lay her palm flat against the arch above and feel for any tremor. There was no tremor. There was only the beam settling into stone the way stone accepted things it had been shaped for. And when the beam was seated, she put her whole weight against it, and it did not move. And above it, when she checked with the candle, the hairline was still a hairline and had not grown. And she sat down on the chamber floor and let her hands shake for as long as they wanted to, because she had not permitted them to shake while she was working. The dominant goose watched her from the back hollow. With the flat, unreadable calm she watched everything with, and Freddie, sitting on the warm limestone with her palms flat on either side of her, said aloud into the quiet chamber only for herself and for the bird, "I mean to keep faith with you. I hope you can see it." The bird blinked once. She turned her head. It was as much of an answer as Freddie was going to get, and it was in some way she could not have justified in Whitcomb's or in a court of law enough. She had been calling on Purnell and Fenwick and Ridley every second week through the first weeks of December when Ephraim Doss made his first public move. It came at the monthly stock and grain meeting in the assay office, which nobody who had grown up in Copper Kettle Flats still called their assay office because nobody had assayed anything in it in a decade. The room was hot with the stove and the crowd. Freddie went in her Sunday bonnet with Silas at her side because she had decided by then that Silas needed to be visible in Copper Kettle, needed to be a face on the street rather than a rumor at a cabin, so that no man of Doss's could ever say later that he had not known the boy existed. Silas sat next to her on the bench with his hands folded exactly the way she had shown him. Ephraim Doss stood up during the general business and made his announcement quietly so that people had to lean toward him, which was, Freddie noted, an old trick. He said that he was prepared to raise his standing offer on any parcel adjoining his Marsden holding to double what he had offered in October, double in cash on the day, for any owner who wished to spare himself a long march. He did not look at Freddie when he said it. He did not need to. Every head in the room, without any of them quite meaning to, tilted a fraction toward where she was sitting. Silas's hand, small and hot, closed around her wrist under the bench. She understood at once with a cold clarity that put a small ringing behind her ears that Doss had heard something, not everything, not the cave, but something. He had heard that a widow who could not afford a 20-cent trade at Whitcomb's in October was somehow keeping her flock and her son fed in December without going into anyone's ledger for credit. He had heard that eggs had appeared at Purnell and Fenwick and Ridley, and that no one in the basin had sold them to him, and that no wagon carrying eggs had come up the freight road since the snows. He had heard enough to double an offer. He was not doubling it to buy her out. He was doubling it because he wanted her to know that he now understood there was something on her land worth more than the land itself, and that his interest had shifted accordingly. She kept her face still. She kept her hand loose under Silas's. She did not stand up. She did not accept. She did not decline. She sat through the rest of the general business as though Doss had never spoken. And when the meeting broke up, she took Silas by the shoulder and walked him out through the crowd at a normal pace, greeting the two women who greeted her, ignoring the men who watched her go. And she put him up on Boaz behind the saddle at the hitching post, and she mounted in front of him, and she rode home in the cold without speaking, because if she had spoken, she would have spoken in a voice that she did not want Silas to hear coming out of his mother. She summoned the four of them to the cabin the next evening. Thad Brightwell, Otilia Vance, Sarah Purnell, Elias Ridley. She did not summon Almira Fenwick because Almira had 4 children and a laid-up husband and no capacity for a meeting after dark. She did not summon Cletus Purnell either because he was 17 and this was not yet a meeting. She was going to bring 17 years old into, though she knew already that he would come to matter and soon. She met them at the door as each rode in, and she settled them at the pine table with coffee she had traded 3 jars of preserved beans for at Whitcomb's the week before. And when they were all seated, she put the Smallsone back seed catalogue on the table, and she opened it to the map, and she began to speak. She spoke plainly. She had learned in the past 2 months that this was the only voice the country respected. She told them about the cave. She told them about the flock and the hollows and the outer margin eggs and the 3 to 4 month keep. She told them about Otilia's 2/3 rule and about her own commitment to it. She told them about the crack over the entrance and about the beam Tad had made her and about how she had seated it alone and how it was holding. She told them about Josiah Merrick on the sorrel horse. She told them about Ephraim Doss in Whitcomb's and about Ephraim Doss at the assay office. She told them in the last sentence that she was not going to be able to keep the mountain's work alive against Doss on her own, and that she was asking them plainly if they would help her build something that could. Nobody spoke for a moment. Thad Brightwell was looking at the map with the same close attention he brought to a piece of iron he was about to shape. Otilia was looking at Freddie with the small pale gleam Freddie had come to recognize as approval. Sarah Purnell had put her cup down and had folded her hands over her mouth, not to hide an expression, but to steady one. And Elias Ridley had gone the color of chalk under his tan and was staring at his coffee as though the coffee had done something he was going to have to answer for later. Sarah spoke first. Her voice was low and firm. "What do you need from us, Winifred?" I need the... Freddie said, a mutual arrangement, not charity, not rescue, a network. Each household puts on the table what they have that would help the rest of us through the winter. And each household takes off the table what they need, and someone keeps an honest account of it. I need someone I trust to help me watch the cave when Doss's men are on the roads. I need someone to help me expand the nesting hollows in the spring, so that the flock does not have to keep telling us with its outer margin how much of its capacity we are already using. I need this valley to speak with one voice to Doss, instead of 8 voices in 8 cabins that he can pick off one at a time. Tad Brightwell nodded slowly. He said without looking up from the map, Cletus Purnell. Sarah's head came up. Tad went on unhurried. Sarah, your boy is 17. He is bigger than most men in this basin. He is quicker than most men in this basin. And he has better eyes than any of us in the dark, because he has been running trap lines since he was 9. If we are going to have anyone watching the north approach to Freddie's land at night this winter, he is the person we want, and he is going to want to do it. And I would rather he did it under my eye and Freddie's than under nobody's. Sarah looked at him for a long beat. Freddie held her breath. What Sarah Purnell was about to be asked to do was to lend her only remaining man to a fight that was not strictly her fight. It was on any straight accounting a great deal to ask. Sarah looked at the map. She looked at Freddie. She looked back at Tad. She said evenly, he is going to want to. That is not the same as him being able to. I will ask him. If he says yes, he will do it on my terms, which is that he sleeps a full night before and after every watch, and that he never carries a loaded rifle. He is not going to be the boy who shot a man for Ephraim Doss to hang. Agreed. Tad's voice was flat and firm. On my honor, on mine, Freddie added, and she meant it, and Sarah nodded once, and it was done. Elias Ridley had not spoken. He had not lifted his eyes from his coffee. Freddie let the silence come to him. She had a suspicion of what was moving in him, though she did not yet have the shape of it. She waited. I have something to say. His voice came out thick. He was not looking at any of them. He was looking at the surface of his coffee as though the surface of his coffee were the only witness he could bear. 2 weeks ago, Ephraim Doss came to my cabin. My youngest was sick. My wife was crying in the back room because she had counted the flour, and it did not add up to the end of December. Doss came to my door and he said if I could tell him where Mrs. Halloran was getting her eggs, he would put $50 in my hand that night and nothing on paper. I told him I did not know. That was true. I did not know then. But I did not tell him no either. I did not tell him no. I let him leave my door thinking I might come back to him if I found out. His head came up. His face was raw. His eyes went to Freddie's and stayed there because he had decided in some way she recognized that if he was going to say this, he was going to say it looking at her. I have not gone back to him. I would not have gone back to him. But I am sitting at your table, Winifred, and I have to tell you before you decide whether I sit at it again. The room went very still. Sarah Purnell's eyes flicked to Freddie's. Tad Brightwell's jaw set. Otilia Vance did not move. She looked at Elias Ridley across the table with the same considering flat calm she had looked at Freddie with 3 weeks ago in her kitchen. And she said at length before Freddie could answer, Elias, did you tell your wife what he offered you? I did not. Are you going to tell her now? His shoulders sagged. Yes. Then sit at this table, Elias Ridley. Otilia's voice was very quiet. A man who tells his wife the ugly thing after the fact is not the same man who tells nobody. And a man who tells the widow at whose table he is sitting is not the same as either. Do the second and the third things. You will be sitting at this table for a long winter. Elias closed his eyes for a beat. Freddie could see him fighting something that was trying to come up out of his chest. He mastered it. He nodded once. He looked at Freddie. Freddie met his eyes, and after a beat that felt longer than it was, she nodded back once in exactly Ottilie's manner, because Otilia had said the true thing, and she was not going to override the true thing with a smaller one of her own. He did not have his color back yet. He would. She was not going to be the woman who withheld his color from him, because he had once in a cold cabin with a sick child hesitated at his own door. What mattered was that he had come to hers. They planned then at the table for another hour and a half. Cletus would take alternate nights on the north approach, starting the next week, with Tad taking the other nights until the deepest cold of January made watching impractical. Sarah would coordinate the egg deliveries westward through the Fenwick and Purnell places so that Freddie's tracks would not be the only tracks in the snow between the four cabins, which would spread the visible pattern across enough ground to muddy any single reading of it. Elias would use his carpentry to shape a set of proper shelved crates for the cold room, and in the spring to help widen the second terrace of the cave into new hollows in the manner Otilia described. Otilia would keep the medical accounts. She would be the one they went to first when a child began to cough or a foot began to swell. And she would tell Freddie which household to bring extra eggs to that week, and Freddie would not ask her to explain her judgments. Tad would keep the ironwork accounts and the general logistics, because he had of all of them the most freedom of movement in Copper Kettle without being remarked upon. They agreed on a monthly meeting in rotation at a different cabin each time, so that no pattern of gathering built up at any single roof for Doss's eye. They agreed that Freddie would carry the sole written record in her own hand, in a language nobody else would try to read in the sewn-in back pages of a seed catalogue that could be dropped into the stove in a single motion if the need ever came. They agreed that the cave itself would be shown to Cletus and to Elias in the spring when they widened it, and to no other person without a full meeting of the group first. Otilia asked gently whether Sarah wanted to see it. Sarah shook her head once. "I will trust the ones who need to see it," she said. "I have 4 children, and I do not need one more thing in my head that a man could get out of me by threatening one of them. Tell me only what I need to know to move the eggs." They rode out one at a time so that 4 horses did not leave the yard together, on a moon so thin it barely showed them the road. Elias was the last to go. He stopped at the door before he mounted. He did not look at Freddie. He said into the cold, "Thank you for letting me stay at your table." She did not answer him, because there was no answer that would not have made the moment smaller than it was. He touched the brim of his hat and rode out. Otilia stayed the last. She stood in the door with her hand on the frame and looked back into the cabin at Freddie and at Silas asleep in the alcove behind the curtain. Her voice was very low. "You are doing it right, Winifred. Keep doing it right. Doss will come at you, and it will not be like the assay office next time. Do not stand alone when he does. Send Silas to me when you need to send him." She squeezed the door frame, once an old woman's small hard grip on solid wood, and she went out into the cold, and Freddie closed the door behind her and stood with her back against it for a long time before she moved. The bad night came on a Thursday 2 weeks before Christmas. She had been in the cave that afternoon on a routine harvest with a load of 31 outer margin eggs, and had come back with the sled and set them on the cold room shelves in the crates Elias had built, and had eaten supper with Silas, and had gone to bed early because Cletus was on watch, and she had promised herself she would trust the boy. The dog Otilia had loaned her that week, a rough grey shepherd bitch named Vesper, who had been keeping the yard at Otilia's cabin for 6 years, went off in the dark at about 10:30. Not the yipping alarm of a strange scent, the low steady growl that meant a person. Freddie was out of the alcove and at the north window with Emmett's carbine in her hands before her boots were fully on. She could see at the edge of the juniper stand 180 yards out 2 dark shapes on foot, not on horses, men on foot moving slow toward the seam, coming for the mountain, not for the cabin. Cletus was moving before she was. She saw him come down out of the small stand of aspens where he had been posted low and quick, and she saw him drop to one knee and light the signal she had given him, a small tin of pitch on a stick that would burn hot and bright for 1 clean minute. The pitch caught. It threw a hard orange light across the juniper stand. The two shapes at the seam froze. She saw one of them turn his face toward the light, and even at the distance and in the flare, she recognized Josiah Merrick by the shape of his shoulders under the coat, and she saw the second man beside him thicker and shorter, and she did not need to recognize the second man. It was enough that a second man was there. Then she heard from the south the sound of Tad Brightwell's roan coming up the road at a full run, which meant Cletus had lit his signal with just enough time. Tad had been in the aspens down at the road end waiting for exactly this, because they had planned for exactly this, because Otilia had told them at the pine table that when Doss came it would not be like the assay office, and Otilia had been right. Josiah Merrick and the other man broke and ran back down the ridge in the dark. They did not shoot. They did not shout. They ran because the signal had told them that whatever they had come to do was not going to be done tonight, and would carry a witness list if they stayed. Freddie stood at the north window with the carbine in her hands, and her breath coming fast and shallow, and Silas awake behind her in the alcove silent, sitting up in the blankets with his eyes very wide. She did not lower the carbine until Tad's voice came from the yard level, and carrying saying only her name, and only then did she let her shoulders drop. And she understood as she lowered the barrel that the war for Silverthorne Basin had without any of them signing anything begun in earnest. Tad came into the yard with his hat gone and a cut across his cheekbone from a low aspen branch he had ridden through in the dark, and he did not dismount. He kept the roan turned so its flank was toward the north approach, so that his own body between the horse and the cabin porch made a screen for Freddie and for the lit rectangle of the doorway behind her. His breath made hard clouds. His voice was quiet. They went south by the draw. Cletus is following at 50 yards to see they clear the property. He will not close on them. He will come back inside a half hour, or I will go after him myself. Freddie put the boy in the cellar. Sir. She did not argue. She turned Silas by the shoulders and walked him to the cellar hatch, and lifted it, and he went down the ladder without a word. And she handed down the wool blanket and the tallow candle already lit in its tin, and she closed the hatch and drew the rag rug back over it. Then she stepped out onto the porch with the carbine across her forearm, not raised, only present. And she took a place beside Tad's horse, where anyone glassing the yard from the ridge would see 2 adults instead of 1. He did not speak again until Cletus came back up the south road at a jog, breathing clean unhurt, and told them both without ceremony that Josiah Merrick and the second man had reached their horses at the section line and mounted and ridden east toward the Doss holdings at a full gallop, and that the second man had been carrying a small canvas bag whose contents had made a metallic sound. Cletus had not been able to identify at 50 yards. Freddie looked at Tad. Tad looked at her. Neither of them said the word. They did not need to say the word. A canvas bag of metal in the hands of a man walking toward a limestone seam at 10:30 at night was a bag of the sort of tools with which a person opened rock, and everyone standing in the yard understood what that meant. She let Silas out of the cellar an hour later, when Cletus had made a full circle of the property line and come back to say the tracks in the fresh snow ended cleanly at the fence with no doublebacks. Silas came up the ladder pale and quiet, and he did not ask what had happened, and she did not tell him more than she had to. She told him only that the visitors had gone, that the mountain was safe, that Mr. Brightwell and Cletus had done exactly what they had come to do. She sat him down at the pine table, and she made him drink half a cup of warm milk, because his breath was rattling badly, and warm milk sometimes settled it. And while he drank, she watched his face across the table, with a specific hard love that felt in her chest, like the sensation of holding a hot coal without dropping it. Cletus took the couch by the stove that night, because Sarah had already sent word by way of Otilia That if the boy stood watch on Freddie's land, he was to sleep under Freddie's roof on any night the weather turned. Tad took the barn over Freddie's protest because Tad had a specific stubbornness about which of them slept where, and she was too tired to fight him on it. And by 3 in the morning, the cabin was still, and she was lying awake in the alcove with Silas warm against her back for the second time in 2 months, listening to a mountain that had not, so far as she could tell, changed its mind about her yet. She rode into Copper Kettle Flats at first light with Tad. She left Cletus at the cabin with Silas, and with strict instructions not to answer the door for any voice he did not recognize. And she and Tad went straight to the small square timbered building at the north end of the main street, where Sheriff Rutherford Caine kept his office over the winter. Rutherford Caine was 48 and had been sheriff of the county for 11 years. And he was the specific kind of lawman a place like Silverthorne Basin produced when it was lucky, which was to say a plain, steady man with a wife and 2 grown daughters back east, and a limp from a Nebraska bar fight in his 20s, and no particular love of Ephraim Doss, but no particular capacity to move against him alone. He listened to Freddie and to Tad, and to the description of the canvas bag without interrupting. In the small overheated office with the potbelly stove crackling behind him, and the ledger open on his desk. When they were finished, he set his pen down. "Winifred, I believe every word you have told me. I am also going to be honest with you because you have not come to me before, and it would be a disservice for me to be less than plain now." His eyes stayed on hers. "I have 2 deputies. One of them is at home this week with a broken hand. The other is Elmer Pogg, who owes Ephraim Doss $200 for a horse he did not need, and who I would not send to a Doss holding to serve a warrant on a fence violation if I could help it. What I have that is worth something to you is a signed record. If you come in and say a thing to me in this office, and I write it down and sign it, that record exists and it does not go away, and if a thing happens to you or the boy or to the smith here, it becomes part of a chain that a territorial judge will read. That is the honest measure of the help I can give you until the drifts clear in March. After the drifts clear, I can do more. Then I want to say a thing to you now, Sheriff, and I want you to write it down." Freddie's voice was flat. "Ephraim Doss offered Elias Ridley $50 in cash to inform on my land. Elias Ridley told me so at my own table in front of witnesses who will speak. Last night, 2 men, one of whom Cletus Purnell and I identified as Josiah Merrick, approached a specific point on my north property line on foot in the dark, with a bag of tools whose weight and sound Cletus is prepared to describe. They did not carry rifles. They carried tools for opening rock. I would like all of that on your page, and I would like Elias Ridley to be able to come in and put his own hand to it when the roads permit." Rutherford Caine picked his pen up. He wrote for a full 10 minutes. When he was done, he read the statement back to her aloud in a voice pitched low, so it did not carry past the door. And Freddie signed it, and Tad signed as witness, and Rutherford Caine countersigned and put the page in the locked drawer behind him. Then he looked at her for a long beat, and he said quietly, "I'm glad you came in, Mrs. Halloran. You should have come in a month ago. I do not blame you for that. I am telling you so you know I meant it when I said the record does not go away." They rode home in a cold, clean light with a small hard sunrise pinking the top of Ironback Ridge, and Freddie was quiet on Boaz, and Tad was quiet on the roan, and neither of them spoke until they reached the aspens above the cabin, and then Tad said without looking at her, "You have friends in this basin, Freddie. More than you know. Do not carry it as though you had none." She did not answer him. She let the sentence sit where he had put it. When they came into the yard, Cletus met them at the gate with the news that Silas had eaten a full biscuit and that his breath had loosened by the middle of the morning. And Freddie found dismounting that her shoulders had unclenched by a small measurable degree for the first time in a week. The first Thursday meeting of January was held at Otilia Vance's cabin, because Otilia's cabin was almost exactly at the geographic middle of the households now involved. And because Otilia is standing in the basin, was old enough and independent enough that a gathering under her roof would carry no particular political scent for anyone who happened to be counting saddle horses. Freddie arrived early with Silas on the back of Boaz, and she was surprised walking Boaz to the hitching rail to see the number of horses already tied. She counted them. 9. She had expected 6. Inside the cabin was warmer than usual. The stove pushed hard and the smell of coffee and pine smoke lay heavy in the air. Sarah Purnell was there with Cletus. Almira Fenwick was there with her oldest daughter Meredith, a serious girl of 15 with her mother's tight mouth. Elias Ridley was there without Marcy. Tad was there. Otilia was at her table sitting straighter than usual, and along the far wall in 3 chairs Otilia must have dragged out from her back room were 3 people Freddie had not summoned. A wiry old man in a patch buffalo coat who did not stand up. A dark-eyed woman in her 40s Freddie recognized from Whitcomb's but had never spoken to, and a young man of perhaps 26 with a smith's forearms and a stranger's open face. Otilia caught Freddie's eyes across the room. Her voice when it came was pitched to reach everyone gathered without seeming to try. Winifred, Ambrose Kettleman drove himself over this morning from the dugout at Bitter Fork. He asked to come. Hetty Blanchard rode with him. Her homestead is on the west edge of the basin, and she has been buying flour for Almira on credit for 2 months without Almira knowing. And this is Reuben Ault, who is new to the basin as of September. He took the old Marsden line shack on the South Fork and is trying to prove up a quarter section. Tad vouches for him. I vouch for the 2 others. If you would rather they were not at this meeting, they will ride home now, and no one will hold it against you. But I believe you will want them, and I believe they will want you, and I have not brought them under my roof to waste your morning. Freddie looked at each of the 3 in turn. Ambrose Kettleman looked back at her with pale, sharp eyes above a beard the color of yellowed newsprint. And something in his gaze was already at ease with her, the way the gaze of a very old man was at ease with anything he had already decided about. Hetty Blanchard looked at her steadily without deference, without apology. The look of a woman who had ridden a long way in cold to do a specific thing and was not going to be turned back at a threshold. Reuben Ault flushed slightly when Freddie's eyes came to him and dropped his own to his hat, which he held on his knees. But he did not stand and leave. Freddie took her time. Then she nodded once to Otilia and to the room, and she came to the empty chair at the head of the table and sat down. I would rather have you at this meeting than not, all 3 of you. Thank you for the ride in this cold. They began. Freddie set the small seat catalog on the table open to the map, and she began to speak exactly as she had spoken at the pine table in her cabin 3 weeks before, without ornament in order. She did not name the location of the cave. She spoke of it as a cold room the mountain kept. She spoke of the flock of the outer margins of the 2/3 rule of the 3 to 4 month keep of Doss's 2 offers of the confrontation in Whitcomb's of the announcement at the assay office, of the 2 men at the seam on foot of the canvas bag of the statement in Sheriff Caine's locked drawer. Ambrose Kettleman listened with his head slightly tilted, in the manner of an old dog listening for the specific step of a familiar person on a porch board. When she was finished, he did not lift his voice. He said from his corner, Mrs. Halloran, I have known about your mountain for 22 years. The room went very still. I was 30 in the summer of 61. I ran trap lines up under Ironback for 9 seasons. There was a Shoshone man I did some trading with in those years, Baptiste Elk, who took me up to the seam in the juniper stand one September afternoon and put his hand into it and let me put mine in beside his so that I would know it was there. His people had known it for longer than any of them could count. He did not take eggs from it. He said his grandmother had told him you did not take eggs from a mountain that was choosing to keep them. He said that the day someone did not understand that any longer would be the day the geese would leave. He told me the seam. He told me the flock. He asked me, since he did not think his people were going to be able to keep coming that far east much longer, to remember it. and not to speak of it to any white man who would put a hand into it in the wrong spirit. I gave him my word. I have kept it. I have not told a living soul in this basin about that seam in 22 years. He paused. His pale, sharp eyes went to Freddie. He said slowly, "I did not come here today to say I knew. I came to say I have not said, and to say that I have watched you, Winifred Halloran, since October, when I noticed the geese going in and the sled going in behind them, and I have decided that you are the person Baptiste would have permitted to put a hand in. I am here because if it comes to a document in front of a territorial judge, my name on your side is worth something. I filed on Bitterfork in '69. I have paper on a map of my own land that shows the whole draw between me and your seam. That paper is dated. Ephraim Doss cannot say the seam is in dispute. It is not. It is in the middle of your 160. Baptiste's people knew it. I knew it. Now you know it. And if it goes to court, so will a judge." The room absorbed this in the specific way. A room absorbed a piece of information that changed the arithmetic of everything already said in it. Thad Brightwell put his cup down carefully, without a sound. Sarah Purnell's hand rose to her mouth. Elias Ridley closed his eyes for a beat. Freddie sat very still with her hands folded on the map, because if she moved, she was going to have to speak, and she was not for a full breath sure what her voice was going to do. She mastered it. "Ambrose, thank you." Her voice was thin but level. "I would ask you before you leave here today to sit with me and Sheriff Caine at whatever cabin he can be brought to, and to make a statement of what you have just said, so that it does not walk out of this room only in the memories of 11 people. Will you?" "I will." He inclined his head. "I have been waiting to make that statement for a while now. You are the reason I finally can." Hetty Blanchard spoke next without waiting for a lull. Her voice was low and hard. "Mrs. Halloran, I have been quiet in this basin for 8 years because a woman who lives alone learns to be quiet in a country where most conversations are not for her benefit. I am not here to be quiet today. I have been buying Almira Phoenix flour under a different name at Whitcomb's since October, because Almira would rather starve than take flour with her own name on the ledger. I have 12 laying hens who are not going to give me an egg until March. If you have arithmetic that could put my hens' future output into a pool now against the eggs from your mountain, now I will sign on to it. If you do not tell me what else I can put in, I am not without means. I am without allies. If you are building allies, I am asking to be one." Freddie nodded once, a small, clean movement. "You are one, Hetty." She looked at Almira Fenwick, who had gone the color of paper at the flower under a different name, and her voice softened by exactly the amount that would keep the moment from becoming public shame. "Almira, it is not a thing that needs answering now. But Hetty is at this table because she is your friend. Set that in your account of her and let us move on." Almira Fenwick nodded without lifting her eyes. Meredith, the 15-year-old daughter, put her hand over her mother's on the table and left it there. And Almira did not shake it off. And something small and slow moved through the room and then past it. Reuben Ouellette, the newcomer, spoke last in a quieter voice than the other two. He said plainly that he had come out from Illinois in April with a wife who had died on the trail of the same fever that had gone through 3 wagons in Wyoming, and that he had come on to Silverthorne Basin because he had bought his line shack quarter section site, unseen from a man in St. Louis, and had nowhere else to go. He said Tad had shod his old draft horse for nothing in October, and had told him, when he had tried to pay, that the smithy kept a running account for men new to the basin, and that he could settle it in labor come spring. He said he had a workable barn and a workable stove, and at present no household to protect. And if there was work of the sort that Cletus Purnell was doing on Freddie's north approach, he would take a rotation, and he would not carry a loaded rifle for it either. Per Sarah Purnell's rule, and he would not, as long as he drew breath, take $50 from any man to look the wrong way in the wrong direction. Freddie looked at Tad. Tad's small nod was all she needed. She looked back at Reuben Ault and said quietly, "Welcome, Reuben. Speak with Cletus after this meeting. He will show you the rotation." They worked for 2 more hours at Otilia's table. They redrew the delivery routes to spread the tracks across all 8 cabins now involved. They set a formal accounting sheet in the back of Freddie's catalogue, into which each household's in and out for the winter would be entered by Otilia's hand, because Otilia's hand was steadier than anyone else's and less likely to be mistaken for anything but a bookkeeper's in the event a lawman ever needed to look at it. They agreed on a plain rule: no household would trade with Ephraim Doss's ranch for any commodity for the rest of the winter. Not because trade with Doss was in itself a betrayal, but because a supply chain to Doss out of a member household would let him build a picture of the group he did not otherwise have. They agreed on the small hard thing: if Doss moved again on any home in any way, no one of them would answer him privately. Every response would come through the meeting, and every response would be signed by all of them. Ambrose Kettleman lifted his coffee cup at that and said very quietly, "A basin that speaks with one voice is a basin a big man does not choose to fight if he can help it. Let us give him a reason to help it." And the sentence sat over the room like a lid setting down on a pot that had been building steam. The meeting broke up before dark. Ambrose rode home in his patch buffalo coat wrapped against the cold in a way that told Freddie he was harder than his years pretended. Hetty Blanchard rode out beside him because their homes lay in the same direction. And Hetty had not said as much, but clearly intended from that day forward to check on the old man every 3rd day of her own accord. Reuben Ault rode south with Cletus. Elias Ridley shook Freddie's hand at Otilia's door before he mounted, and his hand was steady, and he said only, "Winifred, thank you." Freddie touched his sleeve. She did not answer. She was learning that the smaller answers carried further. The trouble came at the end of the month, on the coldest night of the winter so far, when the thermometer nailed to the corner post at Otilia's cabin read -22 in the hour before dawn, and the snow lay a foot deep across the yard, and no one in his right mind would send men across a basin at that temperature to move on another man's property. Ephraim Doss sent them anyway, not to the cave this time, to the goose pen. Freddie woke at 3:30 to Vesper hitting the north wall of the cabin at a full run, snarling, throwing herself against the log at chest height, and to the sound a beat later of glass shattering somewhere on the south side of the yard. She was out of the alcove and into the main room and had the carbine off the pegs before Silas was fully awake in the blankets. She heard then what the dog was answering, not the crunch of boots on frost. The soft huff of horses being held on tight rein at the south fence, and a second breaking sound closer, and a voice she did not recognize saying quietly but distinctly the word torch. She understood in the same beat, not the cave, the goose pen. The reasoning arrived complete and cold. Doss had understood after the night in the juniper stand that opening the seam was going to be harder than his men could manage in the dark without noise, and he had adjusted. He was not going to attack the mountain. He was going to attack the flock. He was going to burn her out of the geese, and then the mountain would be irrelevant, because whatever was in it would have no birds to renew it. It was for Ephraim Doss an elegant piece of arithmetic. He had not counted on the network. He had not counted on the 2 boys already awake in the near dark because Cletus Purnell and Reuben Ault had been on rotation that week. And they had traded off at midnight without Freddie's knowledge because both of them had decided the cold was too hard on a single watch. He had not counted on Thad Brightwell being asleep in Freddie's barn that particular night, because Thad had come in at dusk to reset a bent hinge on the goose pen and had accepted. When Freddie insisted a place on a straw bed against the barn wall rather than a ride home through the cold, he had not counted on any of it. And by the time the men at the south fence had lit their first torch, the yard belonged to Freddie's side. The sound of a rifle fired into the ground 15 feet in front of a horse's hooves at 3:30 in the morning was a sound no rider in Silverthorne Basin was prepared to argue with. Thad Brightwell had come out of the barn with Emmett's spare rifle in his hands, the one Freddie had left racked above the workbench that morning, in case and he did not fire at a man. He fired at frozen ground. The horses at the south fence, being horses in a very cold dark on a night that had not been chosen for them by their better sense, reared and broke. Two of the men on foot in the yard, one of them with a lit pitch torch in his hand, spun toward the sound. In that same instant, Cletus and Reuben came out of the shadow of the east fence at a hard run, and Cletus, who had been running trap lines since he was 9 years old, and whose eyes in the dark were what Tad had said they were, hit the man with the torch low at the waist. In the specific tackle, a large boy learned when he had grown fast in a country with no schoolyard. The torch went into the trampled snow of the yard and hissed out at once because Freddie had made sure, on Otilia's advice, that the trampled snow around the goose pen was kept wet on cold nights for exactly the purpose of drowning a torch. The other man on foot, the taller one, turned and ran for the south fence. Reuben Ault did not chase him. Reuben Ault, who had lost his wife on a Wyoming trail 9 months before, and who did not, so far as Freddie ever learned, own a strong opinion about many things, did what he had been drilled to do that week, which was to break for the south fence himself at a lateral angle so that the running man cleared the yard without going near the barn. He caught the second man 20 feet short of the horses, not with a rifle, with the flat of a shovel he had grabbed off the wall as he ran, and he took the man down with a single practical stroke to the back of the knee that would leave the man limping for a month but would not kill him, and would not importantly put Reuben Ault in front of a territorial judge as a killer. Cletus, with his knee in the small of the first man's back in the light from the doorway of the cabin, where Freddie now stood with the carbine leveled, called out without turning his head, "Ma'am, bring the lantern. He needs to see who caught him." She brought the lantern. She held it up, in the yellow swimming light in the trampled bloodied snow on his belly, with Cletus Purnell's knee between his shoulder blades, and his breath coming in white, ragged clouds, was Josiah Merrick. He looked up at Freddie. His hat had come off. His hair was matted with sweat and snow. His eyes were wide, not with fear, exactly with something more complicated than fear. He looked past her at the doorway. Silas was there. She had told him to stay in the cellar, and he had not. He was standing in the doorway of the cabin in his nightshirt, with a piece of stove kindling in his hand, no bigger than his forearm, gripped in both fists, in the way of a child who has understood wrongly but bravely that he is about to be asked to defend his mother, and whose face is set in the small trembling seriousness of a boy who has decided he will not be found flinching when it is asked. He was 9 years old. His hair was standing up. His feet in the snow at the threshold were bare. Something in Josiah Merrick's face broke. Freddie saw it. She saw it as clearly as she had ever seen a thing in a lit room. She had spent 3 months building a picture of Josiah Merrick as a man on a sorrel horse who came onto her yard to look at her son. What she saw on the ground under Cletus Purnell's knee was a boy of 26 who had been given a task by his father, and who had, for the first time in the doing of it, come face to face with what the task actually meant. His father had sent him out at 3:30 in the morning to burn the pen of a widow whose 9-year-old boy was standing at a threshold in a nightshirt with a piece of kindling in both hands. Whatever Josiah Merrick had told himself he was riding out to do, that specific configuration of facts was not what he had let himself believe he was doing. Freddie watched him understand. She watched it happen the way you watched a thin ice sheet give at the middle of a pond. She did not enjoy it. She did not have room in her chest to enjoy it. She only noted it coldly and precisely because it was information she was going to need later. She said evenly into the yellow light, "Silas, inside, now. Boots on, blanket around you. Do not come out again until I call your name." He obeyed. The threshold went dark behind him. Freddie looked back down at Josiah Merrick. Her voice was very quiet. "Josiah, my son is 9 years old. He has asthma." He was standing in the snow with his bare feet on the ground to protect his mother, because your father sent you to burn our pen in the dark, and my son understood what that meant before you did. Look at me. Do you understand what I have just said? He did not answer for a long beat. Then on the ground with Cletus Purnell's knee in his back, and his breath coming in ragged white clouds and his lower lip cracked from the cold, he said in a voice that was almost inaudible, "Yes, ma'am. Sheriff Caine will be here at first light. He will take you in. You will answer for what you came here to do tonight. That is not a bargain I am offering you. That is a fact." She waited a beat. "What I am offering you one time only is this. If when the sheriff comes, you tell him not only what you came to do tonight, but who told you to do it, and what your father has told you and asked you to do since October, and what your father has done since '81. That I know for a fact you know about, I will speak on your behalf to the territorial court when the time comes. I will not lie for you. I will not soften what you did. I will say only, and I will say it plainly, that when the moment came you chose to stop being the tool your father was making of you. That is the offer. It expires at sunrise." Josiah Merrick closed his eyes. Snow came down in the yard in small dry flakes. Cletus Purnell did not move his knee. Somewhere at the south fence, the horses were still tied, standing in the cold with their heads down waiting. "I will tell him," Josiah Merrick said into the snow, into his own breath. "I will tell him all of it." Sheriff Rutherford Caine rode in at 6:30 with his second deputy, not Elmer Pogue, because Rutherford Caine had at some point in the last 3 weeks quietly borrowed a young man named Perry Halstead from the county at Bitterfork to serve out the winter on his own personal account, without waiting for the county to approve the pay. Perry Halstead was 24 sober as a Sunday and owed Ephraim Doss nothing. He took Josiah Merrick and the second man, whose name turned out to be Cyrus Pettit, and who was an ordinary Doss hand with a bad knee and a longer bad temper, into custody without ceremony. Rutherford Caine sat at Freddie's pine table in his heavy coat and drank coffee, and he watched Josiah Merrick, warmed a little now by the stove and by a blanket around his shoulders, and by the shock of having survived the night, tell the entire thing in a low, tired voice that carried no argument in it. From the words spoken over supper at the Doss Ranch at 9 o'clock the night before, back through the water dam on Deadman Creek, back through the 2 envelopes sent to Freddie in October, and the third that had been drafted and not yet sent back through a January in 1881, in which Ephraim Doss had ridden onto the Marsden holding at night with 3 men, and had persuaded old Marsden, then 80, and no longer of clear mind, to sign a bill of sale for the north half of his land at a fraction of value, and back through the exact locations of 2 other minor land grabs in the basin over the following 2 years, in which Josiah Merrick had ridden as his father's witness, and had signed his own name to documents whose meaning had not been fully explained to him at the time. Rutherford Caine wrote for 2 hours. When he was done, he read the statement back, and Josiah Merrick signed it, and Cyrus Pettit, watching, signed a shorter separate statement of his own, to the effect that he had been paid $20 for the night, and told only to burn the pen and not to touch the cabin or the woman or the boy. And Caine took both statements and put them into his leather portfolio and sealed the portfolio with a strap. He looked across the table at Freddie. He said quietly, "Mrs. Halloran, this will not put Ephraim Doss out of Silverthorne Basin. He is too rich and he is too connected, and a territorial court is not going to hang a man like him on the strength of an ill son and a ranch hand and a widow. What this will do is put him under a formal investigation that will run through the spring at minimum, and it will put a stay on any further land acquisition in this basin under his name until that investigation clears. It will also mean that if he moves on you again, on you personally, or on any signatory here in any way, the investigation will fold that in, and at that point, the arithmetic on his side gets very hard indeed. You have not driven him out. You have put a wall around your basin. I want you to understand the size and the limits of what you have done tonight." Freddie looked at him for a long beat. She said, "Sheriff, I understand it. It is enough. My people can live inside a wall." Rutherford Caine nodded once, and he stood up. and he shook her hand across the table with the flat, kind, official grip of a man who wished to be seen doing it. And he and Perry Halstead rode out with Josiah Merrick and Cyrus Pettit into a sunrise that had at last some real color in it. The first color the sky over Silverthorne Basin had shown in weeks. March came late that year. The snow held into the third week, and the creek did not begin to move under its ice until nearly the 1st of April, and the road out to the Ridley place stayed impassable for wagons until the 10th. When the thaw did come, it came all at once in 3 warm days in a row that turned the yard to mud and the barn to a smell of wet straw and old horse, and Freddie found, on the first of those days, that she could stand on her porch without her coat, for the length of it takes to drink a cup of coffee, and that she could feel the sun on the back of her neck, and that the ache in her hands that had been with her since November had loosened by a small measurable degree. She stood there with the cup at her mouth and the mud running past her boots, and understood without permitting herself to say it out loud, yet that they had come through. The flock had come through with them. Otilia's 2/3 rule had held. Freddie had, on Otilia's standing council, stopped harvesting entirely in the 3rd week of February, to let the flock's laying season begin without disturbance, and by the 2nd week of March, she had counted on a slow, careful walk of the lower terrace, 19 active clutches in the hollows, up from the 23 she had inventoried in October, which sounded on paper like a reduction until she understood. Standing in the warm chamber with the candle in her hand, that 4 of the 23 hollows she had counted in October had never been active in living memory, and had been being kept clean by the flock as expansion room, which the flock, having decided that the humans were tolerable, was now beginning to convert to service. 2 of those newly active hollows were on the 2nd terrace, where Elias Ridley was going to widen the shelf come April. Freddie stood watching the deep dominant female shift her weight on a clutch of 6 pale eggs, and understood with the small clean shock of it that the mountain had in its own opaque way made her a promise for the following winter. She rode into Copper Kettle Flats on the first passable Wednesday to collect the mail. Old Whitcomb handed her 3 letters across the plank counter, and one of them was from a firm of attorneys at the territorial capital, and Freddie opened it at the counter without going home first, because she had learned in the past 4 months not to save hard news for a private room. It was a plain document. It stated that Ephraim Doss, following his indictment on multiple charges of fraud arising from the Marsden Bill of Sale of 1881, had reached a plea agreement with the territorial court, under which he would forfeit clear title to the north. Half of the Marsden holding would pay restitution and fines totaling $3,800, and would remove himself from any and all real estate transactions in the county of Silverthorne Basin for a period of not less than 7 years. He had not gone to prison. He was not going to. He was 52 years old and rich, and the territorial court had accepted the arithmetic that a man of his class in a young territory did not go to prison unless he had killed somebody in plain sight of a preacher. But he was not going to be able to buy a foot of ground in Silverthorne Basin for 7 years. And the north half of the Marsden holding, which included the upper reaches of Dead Man Creek and the dam site, was being placed under receivership pending sale to a party approved by the county. Freddie read the letter twice. She folded it and she put it into her coat pocket, and she said to Whitcomb in a voice that came out of her steadier than she had intended, "Josiah Merrick. 2 months in the county." Whitcomb's face was still. "No felony. He served the 2 months in Bitter Fork already. Word is he has taken work with the Blanchard place cutting fence rails. Hetty hired him herself, said she wanted him where she could watch him." The corner of Whitcomb's mouth moved by a fraction. "You have done something in this basin, Winifred. Half the men in this store this morning were talking about it before you rode in. I will tell you now, since I did not tell you in October when I might have. I am sorry I did not extend Elias Ridley credit when he asked. I have been ashamed of it since. If it means anything, I extended Elmira Fenwick credit last week under her own name for the first time." Freddie looked at him across the counter for a long beat. She said evenly, "It means something, Whitcomb. Thank you." She left the store with her 3 letters and mounted Boaz and rode home, and the road was mud and the sky over Ironback was a clean high blue. And she found herself thinking as she rode not of Ephraim Doss and not of Josiah Merrick, and not of the letter in her pocket, but of a man cutting fence rails on Hetty Blanchard's place in the spring sun, learning what it was to be watched by a woman who did not want him ruined. And she thought for the first time in a long time that a country was not only what it took from you, it was also what it let you become. She began keeping the second notebook in April. She sat at the pine table in the evenings after Silas was asleep in the loft that Tad and Reuben had helped her build during the first warm week. And she wrote in a careful hand what she had learned in the cave, and what Otilia had taught her, and what Ambrose Kettleman had told her. Baptiste to Elk had said about the flock. And she wrote it in the plain language of a woman who understood that she was writing not for herself, but for whoever would need to read it next. She wrote the rules at the front. She wrote the seasonal calendar in the middle. She wrote on the last page in a hand that was slightly firmer than the rest, that the cave was not a possession of any single person and would never be, and that any keeper who came after her was required to bring the next keeper into it before her own death, and that the count of keepers should never at any moment be fewer than 3 or greater than 7, and that the network in the basin was to be renewed at each Christmas by a meeting called under the same rules that had governed the meetings of the winter of 1883 to 1884. She signed the last page, dated it, and closed the notebook, and she sat for a long time with her hand on its cover in the yellow lamplight before she put it up on the shelf above the mantel. Tad Brightwell came out to the cabin on the first Saturday of April to help her set the west fence line, the section she had traded to Cletus Purnell for the winter's eggs. Cletus came, and Reuben Ault came, and Elias Ridley came with a wagon of split posts, and the 4 of them worked the line from 10 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, while Silas ran wire and passed nails and held posts steady with the small serious efficiency he now brought to any task assigned to him. They put in nearly a quarter-mile of fence in the day. When they were done, Cletus and Reuben rode out together with the empty wagon, and Elias stayed for another hour to talk over the barn wall work. He would begin the following week, and then he too rode home to Marcy and the children, and it was Freddie and Tad and Silas in the yard, and the sun was still on the top of Ironback, and the light was golden the way an April light was gold in high country when the aspen buds were about to break. Tad did not go inside. He sat down on the porch step and leaned his back against the post, and he did not speak. Silas ran off to the barn to check on Prudence, who was in her old rocker of a stall, doing her particular impression of being useful. Freddie came out of the cabin with a tin cup of coffee for Tad, and she handed it to him without ceremony, and she sat down on the same step on the other side of the post from him, so that they were both looking out at the yard together, and neither of them at the other. He drank his coffee. She drank hers. A single early swallow cut across the yard low, chasing something invisible, and lifted and vanished into the aspens. Freddie said quietly without turning her head, "Tad, thank you for the beam." He did not answer for a beat. Then he said in the same quiet tone, "I have another one in the shop if you ever need one." The corner of his mouth lifted by exactly the amount that a smith's mouth lifted when a smith was making a joke and also not making one. "I would rather cut it for a barn wall than for a mountain if it came to it, but either way." She let the small silence sit. She said at length, "I have a boy who calls you Mr. Brightwell. I would not mind if at some point he called you something else. When you are ready, when he is ready. I am not asking today." Tad Brightwell put his coffee down carefully on the porch board. He did not look at her. His voice was very quiet. "Freddie, that is a thing I will wait for as long as you need me to wait. Do not ask today. Do not ask this month. Ask when you are ready. I will be here." She nodded once. That was all of the conversation. It was enough. He finished his coffee. He stood up. He whistled once for the roan who came out of the aspens at a walk with his ears up. and he mounted and he touched the brim of his hat at her, and he rode out down the south road at an unhurried pace, and Freddie sat on the porch step alone with her cup, and watched him go until the road bent past the far aspens, and took him out of her sight. And then she went inside to start the fire down for the night, and she did not for a full hour allow herself to think about what she had just said, because she wanted first to make sure it had actually happened. She walked north through the yard at the very last of the light. Silas came with her without being called in. Elias Brightwell's boots that had grown snug on him now, so that Tad had promised him a new pair in the summer, and the two of them stopped at the edge of the juniper stand and stood looking up at the seam in the rock in the fading gold. The geese were coming back in twos and threes, streaming out through the seam in their small, unhurried way, moving past mother and son as though the two humans were part of the yard. Which was Freddie understood exactly what the flock had decided to make of them. Silas leaned against her arm. His breath was clean and even. His voice came up quiet. "Mama, they know the way." "They do." She put her hand on the top of his head. Her voice came out steady and low, meant only for him and for the cold, clean twilight. "They always did. We are the ones who had to learn." She stood a moment longer. Behind them, across the valley, one by one, the cabins of Silverthorne Basin were putting up their columns of smoke into the dusk. 8 of them now she could see from where she stood, thin and pale and separate against the darkening sky, and each of them a household she knew by name, and each of them a household that knew hers. The mountain at her back held its warmth in its patient old way. Winter had asked its questions. She had answered them imperfectly, in company, in time. That she understood now was the only way a country like this one was ever answered at all.